My task is to introduce Erzsébet Takács, the head of department of the social department of social theory at Eötvös Loránd University, but uh, due to her department duties, she is unable to join us this afternoon. But yesterday she sent us her paper, so I'm going to read it up for the audience, and then we can continue with the debate. One must research only if they are curious about something and doesn't know the final results. Possibility space of family sociology in Hungary during the 1970s and 1980s. As part of my investigation to external influences on sociology in Hungary, first I examined the subdiscipline of the sociology of the family. There were a number of reasons for that. On the one hand, there was significant research in this field at 3 different Hungarian workshops: Hungarian Central Statistical Office, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Eötvös Loránd University, during the 1970s and 1980s. On the other hand, there was a paradigm shift on the international scene at the same time. Exploring the paradigm shift promised some intriguing results in terms of the adoption and reception of international developments in the Hungarian sociological research scene. That is why an outline of sociological paradigms of the family is provided below, which is then followed by an introduction to the Hungarian scene, looking at factors that enhanced, hindered, or prevented reception. I grouped the sources that I have used according to the institutionalization of the respective subdisciplines. I looked at the recollections in connection with the Hungarian Central Statistical Office, as well as literature on the history of the office's library. For the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, I examined studies in the journals Sociologia and Társadalmi Szemlélet, Sociology and Social Review, as well as recollections, research reports, and published books. In connection with Eötvös Loránd University, I delved into issues of the journal Szociológiai Figyelő, Sociological Observer, and conducted interviews. I considered the examination of the perspectives of teacher researcher sociologists a priority in terms of Western impact assessment, as sociological knowledge could only reach a wider and not necessarily a limited professional audience due to the peculiarities of university education. I have encountered a number of difficulties concerning this topic. Knowledge produced in an informal way, e.g., research material left in the drawers unpublished, is always problematic, since researchers could only share their results with co-workers due to limitations on publishing because of censorship practices. This means that sociological knowledge could only find its way into professional publicity in a filtered, partial form. Another difficulty is that the scene of sociological research, which was primarily founded on personal relationships, hardly involved following generations. Plenty of research documentation disappeared or was left to waste. As such, a topic could disappear from the research scene for decades, if not explicitly passed along to other researchers. As posterity sees, sociology of the family was a moderate, somewhat unexciting subdiscipline until the 1970s, which was dominated by a consensus on the conjugal model of the family. Social challenges of the time, like class or social injustice, prejudice, or consumption, mostly attracted researchers from other disciplines. Sociology of the family came into the center of attention in the 1970s as the institutionalization of the field quickly started to develop. Population policy discovered the means that sociology of the family could offer, while the family itself started to be more and more difficult to define due to the plurality of family forms, and became an increasingly interesting research topic. The decrease in the number of children and increase of divorces inspired a lot of empirical research with more or less government support depending on the central population policy. However, the functional paradigm of the family had been questioned well before the spectacular changes, often referred to as the crisis of the family. The feminist approach had the biggest role in that, questioning static and hierarchical roles in the family, a refutation of exploitation, unpaid domestic work, and functional family model as such. In the 1960s, Hungarian social scientists dutifully applied the conceptualization of the crisis of the family to exclusively Western bourgeois families, but it is less typical from the 1970s. This flexible approach is hardly true for non-professionals. To this day, changes concerning gender roles in the family, marriage, and decisions about one's own body are still referred to as crises in debates on population growth. And for the same reason, emancipation struggles for change are still condemned. Since I described in detail in my last year's presentation the institutional changes enhancing and hindering family sociology research in different scenes, now I will focus on highlighting the factors enhancing and hindering reception. A number of factors enhanced and hindered the reception of Western academic and cultural influences. The possibilities of Hungarian researchers to receive information as well as their room for maneuver was greatly influenced by the receiving context, such as external pressure and opportunities, and the considerations of the political decision makers of the time, namely, the decision by Moscow to encourage academic research in 1969, the Helsinki Declaration on Free Flow of Ideas and Information in 1975, as well as exchange programs within two-sided agreements with various capitalist countries. In the following, I intend to highlight the hindering or enhancing factors for reception that emerged in my research into sociology of the family. Firstly, let me emphasize the opportunities in international cooperation, that is, joint international research, not just because of their self-evidence, but for specific instances. Although Sándor Szalai was removed when sociology was institutionalized in the 1960s in Hungary, he built an impressive career in research management on the international sociological scene. For example, the International Comparative Time Budget Research from 1966, led by Szalai, involved 12 countries. As such, it was a great opportunity on various levels. Hungarian researchers involved in the project were given much freedom in terms of research, as the Soviet Union was part of the common project. The research in Hungary was led by such later major figures as family sociologist László Cseh-Szombati and social work founder Zsuzsa Ferge. But Szalai took care of foreign research trips for more Hungarian researchers before 1966. That is how Cseh-Szombati could participate in a UNESCO seminar in Oslo in 1964 and learn empirical methods from Paul Lazarsfeld, perhaps the greatest sociologist of the post-war period. He continued to use these notes and teach methodology from them even in the 70s. In other words, Participation in international research meant more liberal research conditions and even the possibility to co-publish with Western authors on multiple occasions. The research itself was a valid source for writing papers within the country for a good 1.5 decades. The most dynamic part of socialist sociology in the 1970s was research into the quality of life, as this notion was also embraced by Marxist ideology as a useful approach in international ideological struggle, which could be contrasted to income or supplemented with consumers' goods. It seems that a lot of papers were allowed to be published as an excuse for lifestyle research, taking advantage of the international reputation of Salah's research, and they could reach a professional audience, which otherwise would have been hardly or not at all reached. International researchers could be presented at international conferences, which provided opportunities for networking and acquiring literature, for example, copies distributed at conferences. The professional audience at home could benefit from these conferences indirectly, as otherwise hardly publishable ideas could find their way into reports on conferences. Publishing the keynote speeches of conferences were especially suitable for that. Foreign scholarships had a significant role in enhancing the institutionalization of certain subdisciplines and academic fields. There were instances when the foundation supporting the scholar provided them with a certain sum for buying foreign books. Some of this legally acquired foreign literature was lent to other colleagues who made notes for their own purposes. I have already touched upon the role of libraries. Evidently, both the library of the Hungarian Central Statistical Office and the Metropolitan Ervin Szabó Library made use of their acquisition potentials to the maximum. When examining the Russian literature, it is apparent that cited Western authors could be accessed earlier, often much earlier in Hungary, but they were published sooner in Hungarian than in Russian. In terms of libraries, the question arises, who could access Western literature? Evidently, researchers of Hungarian Central Statistical Office were able to do so, so were researchers in Budapest, university lecturers to a lesser extent. Universities outside Budapest and minor research centers were in dire need of these opportunities. Only a small part of the professional audience had no problem with keeping up with significant Western academics. The lack of access, the impossibility to copy, and the limitations that followed keep coming up in interviews. That is also why translations and reviews had a great significance. Review writing was considerably more prestigious at the time than today, since reviews informed the academic community about the publishing of Western works and new ideas in them. When assessing the impact of Western literature, the problem of adopting terminology arises. When can we talk about loaning terms to describe domestic phenomena, and when is it the adoption of the research topic itself, even if the problem or area examined had not existed before? Recollections gathered through interviews revealed that the researchers of the era deliberately wanted to adopt Western concepts. As István Kemény remarked, it was natural that we took foreign published material and we used them as reference. We adopted them as we could. Debates concerning ideology was a different issue, but Hegedűs, Ferge wrote about it at that time. In the published items of Hungarian Central Statistical Office, we tried to use the categories of classes that were in Western books. There were practical reasons for adoptions, such as making research easier as well as providing theoretical background methodology and theoretical framework as well, comparability on an international scene. However, we can encounter examples for the adoption of Western problems, or at least research preferences, such as researching old age in family sociology, which could be integrated into international projects due to the increased interest around it, or the intergenerational transfers from the 1980s. Tibor Kuci came to the conclusion by analyzing articles in Valóság journal called Reality in the 1970s that almost all adopted concepts are English, French, or German terms, which, according to the author, signals a utopic element in the terms as they were applied to describe an unevenly modernized society. After the political transformation, it was often the case that new terms appeared to replace old ones, especially in the border areas of sociology. Such terms were the aforementioned generation transfer in family sociology and glass ceiling, glass wall in gender studies. In terms of impact assessment, I would like to mention two factors briefly: the transfer role of Polish sociology and Mária Mákusz, as well as the potentials of education. As for the socialist countries, Polish sociology was in a distinguished situation due to its historical traditions, its close relations with Western sociology on a personal and professional level, and to its quick re-institutionalization. The significance of Mária Mákusz, who had Polish origins from her mother's side, in transmitting the results of Western social sciences was acknowledged and highly appreciated by her contemporaries. Her over and special role in Hungarian sociology and philosophy deserves separate examination. Here, only one element is highlighted: the adoption of qualitative method based on biographical sources. It had been used in Polish sociology since the 1920s. William E. Thomas and Florian Znaniecki's The Polish Peasant could have been known for Hungarian academics in theory. The method had been applied here for a good 40-50 years. At the beginning of 1972, the Sociological Research Institute of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, with Hungarian Radio and Nők Lapja, women's magazine, launched the research Successful Lives, sikeres életek, based on the ideas of Mákusz, and thousands of biographies arrived. Later on, more and more researchers used personal documents. For example, Katalin Hanák in her research on foster children, or sociologist Péter, who found this method in West German literature. Surprisingly, the role of higher education for Western impact of sociology of the family has not been explored yet. It might be because, okay, I'm losing my voice. It might be because it is evident but difficult to measure, or for other reasons, as it is apparent that most students of sociology do not find employment as researchers. The jargon, the integration outside the integration of certain concepts, the knowledge shared cannot be overestimated, not exactly in academic context, but outside the profession. What is even more important, learning a perspective, a viewpoint, developing sensitivity to certain problems. In terms of Western academic and cultural influences, these carry more significance than certain academic works being integrated in some author's work, although in that case, reception is apparent and can be verified. Political and economic factors hindering reception. Theoretical and practical problems were present on the scene of Hungarian sociology of the family, just like anywhere else. However, the room for maneuver was significantly different in various subdisciplines. Maria Markus, who had been doing important research in sociology of the family from the beginning, was among the outcasts and the banned from the early 1970s. The publishing of the relevant research was considerably influenced by the repercussions István Kemény had to face after his research on poverty in 1968. But there were other bans, party directives, denouncement of research, especially if somehow connected to the working class. These losses are hard to recognize in retrospect, or they might fade away, but they did add significantly to the operation of self-censorship at the time, which had its mark on Western reception. Risky forms of knowledge remained in closed circles due to the political pressure and ideological confirmation, which led to the development of personal oral culture, as mentioned before, and finally to its disappearance. As a consequence, an expert stopped his or her research due to a change of interest or personal reasons. The research could not be continued by others because of lack of public data or access to reports. A closed circle of researchers is an obstacle to Western influences, regardless of the political situation, and not just due to lack of capacity. Discussions among unchanging group of individuals always took place in a confined personal space. The interests, tastes, and excess of the members determined Western theories and methods applied in social sciences. One of the most influential paradigms of the 1960s and 70s, interactionism, for example, was absent from Hungarian sociology, while the network research, network analysis for a long time, that grew out of it became a popular field of research by the end of the 1980s due to the internationally acknowledged work of Róbert and Róbert Tardos. Knowledge remaining in closed circle, with all its negative consequences, was also caused by banning certain fields, like demographics from education. International cooperation was hindered by a number of difficulties on the organizational level. Péter talked about the total failure of a promising project with American researchers, which had a cluster of typical hindering factors. The project Kinship and Aging in 1985-86 involved Hungarian Central Statistical Office, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and Eötvös Loránd University. The leader of the Sociology of the Family section of the American Sociological Association initiated the cooperation, offering finance. The Americans were mainly interested in what role relatives have in taking care of the elderly beside the existing institutional possibilities. It turns out from the interview that even communication among the three institutions and their leaders caused difficulties. Data collection was made problematic and impossible by the constant control and censorship of the questionnaires conducted in the Hungarian Central Statistical Office. The American research method with computerized data processing and the slow, convoluted Hungarian ways were not compatible. Moreover, the majority of American researchers were retired from university education, so they were not motivated to publish the research, and Hungarian researchers had no lobbying potential to publish in American journals, which seemed out of reach anyway. The research was left in the drawer. Publications in foreign journals for Hungarian researchers of sociology of the family were extremely difficult due to the clearly defined nature of the subdiscipline in America. This was especially significant as potential research partners were chosen for new researches based on publications, but it involved insurmountable difficulties to get into American professional journals. That is why it was of utmost importance to maintain already existing relationships. That is why participants embedded in international academic life were important. Due to the limitations of Hungarian researchers reaching Western countries, even if only in terms of professional publicity, the significance of foreign experts visiting Hungary was enormous. However, it had its strict limitations. In the 1960s, it was so problematic to invite experts, even with the right Kádár sheet, and to have it approved, that in most cases, they did not even start the process. Although it eased by the second half of the 1970s, there were financial obstacles to the invitations. What remained to resort to internationally financed conferences and, rarely, the lectures and resources of foreign embassies. The obstacles of receiving foreign intellectual and cultural influences listed so far are primarily external characteristics of the system. There were obstacles concerning mentality, to put it in an euphemistic way, theoretical issues which are more difficult to grasp but also carry major significance. On the one hand, the question, what do we have to offer to the West, was more rarely asked than what can the West offer to us. The relationship was hardly characterized by mutuality, rather than how to profit from the other party. At the same time, intellectual confinement and a conservative way of thinking was also an obstacle of reception. Modern tendencies associated with population decline, which are part of the theory of the demographic transition, were unacceptable for the Hungarian public, who were informed on the topic not by demographists or sociologist experts, but by journalists and self-proclaimed writers with folkish backgrounds, terrified of population decline. Public opinion, constantly under strong pro-natalist influence and not far from the political leadership, had its impact on the profession as well. The most important Western theory of modernization could only be interpreted in terms of decline in Hungarian thinking. In spite of the obstacles, adoption was incessant. The debate that had high stakes in the 1960s on the similarities of capitalist and socialist societies, converging social theories, and the harmful effects of de-ideologization that followed was settled in the 1970s. Adopting the carefully chosen Western example was represented as something evident, rather than as an aim to catch up. From the second half of the 1970s, Hungarian academic institutions saw a benchmark in the international world order rather than the socialist one, especially because research had to be harmonized with the vogue demands of existing socialism. This meant uncertainty and constant unpredictability, as some of the research could not be made public for political reasons, and a significant part was in fact ruined. Expertise being ignored and the results staying in drawers were frustrating, especially for demographists who had a lot of proposals about population policy by request of political leadership, but their proposals were finally disregarded by the political decision makers. A natural consequence of possibilities being closed down internally was that the expertise of researchers was made use of externally. As we can see, in case of demographists, they put more and more effort in the integration into Western academic life. In the late Kádár era, there was band or state samizdat research on the sociological scene that provided opportunity for cooperation with Western researchers and institutions. Thank you very much for your attention.